You made your choice, and now you have to live with it, I said, my voice steady as the desert wind. Abigail flinched, just barely. She had always been good at keeping her composure, but I knew her well enough to see the little cracks. The way her fingers twitched at her sides, how she inhaled a second too sharply. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. I let the silence hang between us. The kind that makes weak people uncomfortable. The kind the desert teaches you to respect. My name is Uriel Hudson, 58 years old. I've spent most of my life in the desert, leading expeditions, teaching rich tourists how not to get themselves killed in the heat. My grandfather taught me the land when I was young, how to read the rock, listen to the wind, track a man who didn't want to be found. He always said the desert doesn't forgive mistakes. He was right. I run a small outpost outside of Red Mesa, Arizona. Folks come through needing supplies, guidance, sometimes just a story or two. The desert has a way of humbling a man. Strips away everything unnecessary. That's why I liked it. That's why I thought I understood people just as well. Turns out, I gave one person too much credit. The first time I noticed something off about Abigail, I chalked it up to routine. People get distant, they drift. But it had never been like this. A little too careful with her words. A little too presentable for a woman who had no real reason to be dressing up. I ignored it at first. Let it slide. Then I found the receipt. Santa Fe. A boutique hotel she had no business being at. One night, 2 guests. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the weight of it settle in my gut. I didn't say anything. Not yet. A man doesn't accuse without proof. That's a fool's mistake. So I paid attention. She started coming home later, blaming errands, saying she'd lost track of time. The way she said it was too casual, too rehearsed. I checked the mileage on her car, didn't match her stories. Her phone, always turned face down now. I didn't ask questions I already knew the answers to. Instead, I went to Noah. Noah York had been tending the bar in town for over 30 years. Same stool, same routine, same low voice that never said too much but always knew more than he let on. Need a drink? He asked when I walked in, wiping down the counter like always. Just information, I said, sliding onto a stool. He set the glass aside, leaned in. That's so? I didn't dance around it. Abigail's been meeting someone. Noah didn't blink. You already know the answer, or you wouldn't be here. I nodded. He sighed, glanced at the clock like he was deciding how much he wanted to be involved. Finally, he said, O'Connor. That was all I needed. Theodore O'Connor. Smooth talker, the kind that never stays in one place too long. Had a reputation with women looking for something different. I knew the type. I didn't react, just took in the information. Noah studied me, waiting to see if I'd explode or break. I did neither. You gonna do something about it? He asked. Already am, I said, standing up. Tossed a bill on the counter. Appreciate it. Noah nodded once. Don't burn down my bar when it all comes to a head. Wouldn't dream of it. I walked out, already planning my next move. Abigail didn't know it yet, but her little secret wasn't a secret anymore. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I took a drive out past the old mining roads, where the sky stretched wide and the heat shimmered off the rocks like a mirage. Thinking was easier out there, away from town, away from people. I let my hand rest on the wheel, watching the sun dip low, turning the sky to fire. The truth sat in my chest like a stone, solid and unmoving. It wasn't the betrayal that got to me. Not really. It was the insult of it. The carelessness. Like she thought I wouldn't notice, like I was some fool too blind to see what was right in front of him. I wasn't one for outbursts. That wasn't how a man won a fight. You won by staying ahead, making the other side show their hand first. So I waited. The next morning, I left early, made sure Abigail saw me pulling out of the driveway. I wanted her to think she had the day to herself, that she could move around without me watching. She barely looked up from her coffee when I walked out the door. I didn't say goodbye. I parked a mile outside town, near an old service road where I wouldn't be seen, then walked back in. Took my time. Had a cup of coffee at the diner, made small talk with the regulars. Just another morning. Nothing out of the ordinary. Around noon, I stepped outside and leaned against the railing, tipping my hat down low, watching. Abigail's car pulled out of our driveway right on schedule. She headed east, toward Rio Rojo. Straight to him. I took my truck and followed, slow, keeping enough distance so she wouldn't notice. I knew where they were meeting before she even turned down the street, the Red Cactus, a quiet little spot with just enough class for someone like her to pretend she wasn't doing what she was doing. I pulled into a spot across the street, angled so I had a clear view of the entrance. She walked in alone, But it wasn't long before O'Connor showed up. I'd seen him around before, never paid much attention. He was taller than me, softer in the way city men usually are. Clean shave, silver at his temples, dressed like he belonged in a catalog instead of the desert. He kissed her on the cheek, and she smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years. I sat there for a while, watching them through the window, their heads bent close together. She laughed at something he said, touched his hand on the table. He leaned in like he was whispering something just for her. It was a good performance. Almost convincing. After an hour, they left together, walking slow like they had all the time in the world. She slid into his car like it was nothing, like she belonged there. I let them go. I didn't need to follow. I'd seen enough. That night, I went home like normal. Let myself in, washed up, made coffee. Abigail came home late, hair a little too perfect, a hint of something floral clinging to her clothes. She didn't look at me when she walked in, just set her purse down and busied herself in the kitchen like she could pretend everything was fine. "Good day," I asked, taking a slow sip from my cup. She hesitated. Just for a second. "Busy," she said, not turning around. "Yeah." I let the silence stretch. Watched her shoulders tense the way they did when she was caught in a lie. "You see anyone interesting?" That was the moment. The one where she could have come clean, could have told me the truth, faced it head on. Instead, she shook her head. "No, not really." I let out a slow breath. Set my coffee down with a soft clink. That was all I needed to hear. I didn't lose sleep over it. That's what she expected, that I'd lie awake, tortured by the thought of her with him. Maybe she even wanted that, some proof that she still mattered to me. But I wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. The next morning, I went about my business like nothing had changed. Pulled my boots on, filled a thermos, drove out to check on a client who had hired me to guide a small group through the canyons next week. Work was work, and I wasn't the type to let emotions get in the way of getting things done. Abigail acted normal too, which told me everything I needed to know. No guilt, no second thoughts. She was comfortable with her lies now, had settled into them. If she thought she was fooling me, she was an even bigger fool than I'd given her credit for. At sundown, I made my way back into town and took a seat at the bar. Noah gave me a nod, slid a glass in front of me without asking what I wanted. "You ready to talk about it?" he asked. I took a slow sip, let the burn settle in my throat. "Nothing to talk about." He snorted, leaning on the counter. "Yeah? You just happened to be parked across from the red cactus yesterday." I didn't answer. "Listen," he said, voice low. "I seen men handle this all kinds of ways. Some get mad and make fools of themselves. Some try to fix things that can't be fixed. Others just let it eat. I'm alive." He studied me for a second. "I don't take you for any of those types." "I'm not," I said, setting my glass down. Noah gave a slow nod. "Good. Then I'd say it's time to move on, make sure she knows it." I already had. That afternoon, I'd met with my lawyer. I had no intention of begging or dragging this out. The papers would be drawn up by the end of the week. The house was mine before we married, and she had no claim to my business. I'd make sure she walked away with what she came in with, nothing more, nothing less. But before I handed them over, I wanted to make one thing clear. The next evening, I got cleaned up, put on a pressed shirt I hadn't worn in years, and took Willow Peterson out to dinner. She'd been running her ranch alone since her husband passed, and we'd always gotten along. I wasn't looking for anything serious, but that wasn't the point. Word would get back to Abigail. She needed to understand that I wasn't waiting around, that she'd already been replaced in every way that mattered. And sure enough, when I got home that night, she was waiting. Arms crossed, back stiff, that practiced calm slipping just enough for me to see the frustration beneath it. "You were with her," she said, voice steady but cold. I set my keys on the counter, met her eyes. And her mouth tightened. "So that's it?" Just like that. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You made your choice, Abigail. You don't get to be mad that I made mine." She scoffed, shook her head. "You never even asked why." I gave a dry chuckle. "I don't need to. I already know." She stared at me, waiting for me to ask, to care, to give her something to work with. I didn't. After a long silence, she turned and walked out of the kitchen. I didn't watch her go. Didn't need to. I'd already won. A few days later, the divorce papers were ready. I didn't rush to hand them over. Timing mattered. Let her sit in the uncertainty a little longer. Let her wonder if I'd cave, if I'd lash out, if I'd fight for something she'd already thrown away. I kept living my life. Took a few more jobs, spent time out in the desert, let the land do what it always did, clear my head, remind me what actually mattered. The air was cooler now, the late autumn wind cutting through the canyons, the kind of sharp that wakes a man up. I rode out one afternoon, past the old cliff dwellings, let my horse take its time picking through the rocky trail. When I got back to town that evening, I stopped by the bar. Noah was there, as always, wiping down glasses, pretending not to know everything about everyone. He glanced up when I walked in, nodding toward the back booth. "She's been here a while," he said. I followed his gaze. Abigail, sitting alone, a drink in front of her, barely touched. She was waiting for me. I walked over, slid into the booth across from her. She looked tired. Not broken, not regretful, just tired. Like the weight of everything was finally settling on her. "You going to keep making a show of this?" I asked. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You don't even care, do you?" I leaned back, stretching my arm across the seat. "What exactly am I supposed to care about? The fact that you cheated? Or the fact that you thought I'd fall apart over it?" She looked away, fingers tightening around her glass. "It wasn't about hurting you." "Yeah." I gave a humorless chuckle. "Could have fooled me." She swallowed hard. I wanted to feel something again." I nodded slowly, taking in the words. "And did you?" She didn't answer right away. Not the way I thought I would. That's the thing about chasing a feeling. It's never enough. I pulled out the envelope, slid it across the table. "Here. Divorce papers. All taken care of." Her breath caught just a little, just enough for me to notice. "You didn't even want to talk about it first." I looked her in the eye, voice steady. "What's there to talk about, Abigail? You made a choice. I'm just making mine." She stared down at the papers, running a hand through her hair. "It's really that easy for you?" I shrugged. "It's simple. Not easy." She let out a slow breath, looking past me, past the bar, like she was seeing the whole picture now, seeing just how little she had left. The affair wasn't some grand romance. It wasn't an escape. It was just another bad decision. And now, she had to live with it. I stood up, tossing a few bills on the table. "You take care of yourself, Abigail." She didn't stop me as I walked out. Didn't call after me, didn't argue. Maybe for the first time, she realized she'd lost. I stepped outside, breathing in the cold night air. The town was quiet, lights glowing soft in the windows, the sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk the only thing breaking the silence. I pulled my jacket tight against the wind and kept walking. I had nothing left to say. The weeks passed, and life moved forward the way it always does. I didn't waste time looking back. There was work to do, and I did it. The desert doesn't stop for anyone. I spent more time out in the canyons, taking on longer expeditions, training a young guy named Edward who had come through town looking for work. City kid, barely 25, thought he knew more than he did, but he listened when I talked, and that counted for something. I taught him how to read the land, how to track, how to let the desert teach him instead of trying to fight against it. "You ever get tired of being out here alone?" he asked one evening as we sat around a small fire, the sky stretching black and endless above us. I stared into the flames, the wood crackling low and steady. Never been alone out here a day in my life. He didn't understand yet. Maybe he would, in time. Back in town, people had stopped looking at me like they were waiting for a reaction. Abigail had signed the papers, moved out of the house within a month. Word was, she tried to get something started with O'Connor, but that burned out fast. He left town not long after. Probably moved on to the next woman looking for an escape. Didn't concern me. One evening, I was restocking supplies when Willow stopped by. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching as I counted inventory. "You gonna keep hiding out here? Or you finally ready to come over for dinner?" I glanced up. "That an invitation?" "It's a statement of fact," she said. "You've been circling for weeks. Figured I'd put it plain." I smirked, setting down a crate. "I don't do circles, Willow." "Good. Then I'll see you Sunday." She walked out before I could answer. I shook my head, but I wasn't about to argue. Sunday came, and I showed up at her place just after sunset. The ranch was quiet, the smell of mesquite wood drifting from the back porch. She had a bottle of whiskey set on the table, 2 glasses, no frills, no nonsense. "You hungry?" she asked, already pouring. "Always." We ate in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need filling. She didn't ask about Abigail, and I didn't bring her up. When the plates were empty, she leaned back, studying me. "You ready to start living again, Uriel? Or you just here to prove to yourself that you can?" I let the question sit for a second, rolling the glass between my fingers. "Haven't stopped living." She nodded once, like that was the right answer. "Good." She poured another drink. and we let the night roll on. Winter came slow that year. The nights stretched longer, the mornings crisp and clear. The desert air carried a bite, the kind that settled into a man's bones if he wasn't moving. I kept moving. Business was steady, and I took on more clients than usual, spending weeks out on the trails. The land was quiet, predictable. People weren't. That was the difference. One afternoon, I was working on my truck when I heard the sound of tires rolling up the dirt road. I wiped the grease off my hands and stepped out from under the hood. Abigail. She parked, but she didn't get out right away. Just sat there, staring through the windshield like she was trying to work up the nerve. Eventually, she stepped out, arms wrapped around herself though it wasn't cold enough for that. She looked thinner, worn down. Different from the woman who used to walk into rooms with her back straight and her chin up. I didn't say anything. Just waited. She cleared her throat. I heard you've been busy. I leaned against the truck. That a question? She glanced at the ground, then back up at me. I don't know what I expected coming here. Neither do I. She let out a breath, slow and unsteady. I thought maybe we could talk. I looked past her, out toward the horizon where the sun was starting to dip. About what? She hesitated. Everything. I shook my head. Everything's already been said, Abigail. She looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she sighed, rubbing her hands together like she could pull warmth from a fire that wasn't there. Theodore left. Of course he did. That hit harder than she wanted it to. Her jaw tensed. I was wrong. I nodded once. Yeah, you were. Silence stretched between us. There used to be comfort in it, years ago. Not anymore. You look good, she finally said. Better than I've seen you in a long time. That's because I am, I said, not bothering to soften it. She swallowed hard, then nodded. I should go. I didn't stop her. Didn't offer her a place to sit. Didn't invite her in. Some things don't need closure. They just end. She got in her car and pulled away. I watched until the dust settled. Then I turned back to my truck and got to work. A month passed, then another. Life had a way of settling back into its natural order, like a river finding its course again after a flood. I spent more time on the land, took longer trips out into the deep desert, away from town, away from people. Not because I was running from anything. I'd already handled that, but because it's where I belonged. Willow and I saw each other when we felt like it. No expectations, no games. She was steady, didn't ask for things I wasn't willing to give, and I respected that. She had her ranch, I had my work, and sometimes our paths crossed. That was enough. One afternoon, I was finishing up repairs on my cabin when a familiar truck pulled up the road. My son, Quentin. I set my wrench down and wiped my hands on my jeans as he stepped out, shaking his head like he still couldn't quite believe he was here. Thought I'd find you knee-deep in some canyon, he said. I smirked. Didn't feel like getting lost today. He looked around, hands in his pockets. Mom called me. I let the words settle. That's so. He nodded. She wanted to know if I'd talk to you. Said she felt like she didn't have anybody left. I leaned against the railing, waiting. I told her she made that bed, he said. Told her you didn't owe her a damn thing. I met his eyes, gave a slow nod. That's right. He exhaled, shaking his head. You were right about all of it. I just didn't want to see it. People see what they want to, I said. Until they don't. He studied me for a second. You good? I let out a slow breath, looking past him, past the road, out toward the horizon where the sky met the rock. Better than I've been in years. He seemed to take that in, nodding like he understood. Well, I got a case of beer in the truck. Thought maybe I'd stick around, give you a hand with whatever needs doing. I smirked. Now you're talking. He went to grab the case, and I stepped inside for a couple of glasses. By the time I came back out, the sun was getting lower, stretching long shadows across the dirt. We sat on the porch, cracked open the beers, let the silence settle. I thought about Abigail once, then let it go. The past was done. The land was still here. And so was I.